I'm going to tell you a story. It's a story that many of you might be familiar with, but I don't believe that it's been told properly, and it hasn't been told properly in the context of what that story means for us. Like many good stories, it's allegorical. And I won't insult your intelligence by teasing out all of those analogies in this story, but I'll give you a few hints along the way. It is a story that is about a crisis. Now, you may have heard this expression. You may have heard the expression during the global pandemic, never waste a good crisis. And of course, if you look it up on the internet, everybody will tell you this aphorism is down to Winston Churchill or Benjamin Franklin or some wit like Oscar Wilde or somebody else. In actual fact, and I know this to be true because I know the guy who coined this phrase, it was actually coined by a guy called Rahm Emanuel. Rahm Emanuel is currently the US ambassador to Japan. He was the mayor of Chicago for a long time, and prior to that, he was Barack Obama's chief of staff. And he said to a meeting of New York journalists and others in 2008 in the global financial crisis, you never want a serious crisis to go to waste. And what he meant by that was a crisis gives you the opportunity to do things differently. It gives you the opportunity to take risks. It gives you the opportunity to put in place legislation that might be resisted under normal circumstances. It gives you the opportunity to invest in technology. Look at what happened with developing drugs for COVID, which people predicted would take 10, 15, 20 years, that we did within 18 months. So that's what he meant by that. Yes, crises, we don't want them, but when you have one, it is an opportunity to change. So the story I'm going to tell you about is about a crisis that involved a growing population, a significant growth in our cities in the 19th century. And if you look here at the numbers, you can see it for yourself. London grew by 6.5 times between 1800 and 1900. Vienna grew by 7 times. Paris grew by 7 times. New York, because of the mass import of migrants into New York, grew by 60 times in its size. And that created a crisis around a number of things that should sound very familiar. It was a crisis of mass urbanization, encroaching on farmland, and the inability of any more farmland to be able to produce the feedstock that it was needed for the animals that were used. It also involved a crisis around water usage. Not enough water to actually irrigate that farmland, but also a lot of our eutrophication of those water systems and pollution of those water systems. It also involved disease being spread between animals and humans because of those great growth in population. But that crisis, although that's very familiar to what we have, was called what Steve Davis, in an article 20 years ago in 2004, coined the phrase, the Great Horse Manure Crisis of 1894. Some of you will have heard this story. It's often told by technologists. It's not told particularly well, so forgive me my hubris for thinking I'm going to tell the story better. But it is an important story that we can learn from. London, in 1900 and 1990, had 11,000 horse-drawn cabs. It had several thousand horse-drawn buses with up to 12 horses used per day working on those. It had several thousand carts, drays, wains, all delivering goods and services. It had in excess of 100,000 horses working in London every day. Those horses were producing, on average, 12 kilos of manure per day deposited on the streets. 1.2 million kilos of manure per day, 1,200 tons of emissions being produced every day, over 400 million tons per year of horse manure. Every day at the end of the day, the streets of London look like this. And it required a gang of workers to go in there shoveling it, of course, onto a horse and cart, which was producing more manure, to get the streets cleared before people came to work the next day. And in fact, supposedly, some wit in the London Times said that in 50 years, every street in London will be buried under 9 feet of manure. In fact, when Steve Davis published this and called it the Great Horse Manure Crisis of 1894, everybody rushed to find the original sources, and the Times said, we never published an article like this. This is fake news. But there really was a crisis. All right? And that crisis affected all these major cities. Just to give you one example, in the USA, in the early 1900s, oats grown for horse feed were the 3rd largest agricultural crop, occupying 50 million acres of farmland. There was not enough farmland without further deforestation to grow the oats you needed for the horses needed to supply this growing population. Should sound very, very familiar. If we just move forward another 100 years, of course, oats is gone. The 3rd biggest crop in America now that's grown is soy. The 2nd biggest is corn. The 1st biggest is hay. All 3 of those crops, over 70% of those crops, go into animal feed. So we haven't really removed the need for oats. We've simply transplanted it with different crops that are going into animal agriculture. So, of course, the technologists tell this story, and they tell a story about how technology solved the problem, how the internal combustion engine came along and solved the problem. It's not quite that simple. In fact, technologies have been around that could have solved the problem for at least 100 years by the time this crisis came. In fact, the steam engine had been developed in the 1700s, and the steam engine provided all sorts of opportunities for transport. It was already being used for trains, for steamships, and so on, but it was not good for road transport. In fact, this example of the steam bus existed in 1860. It was more powerful than a horse-drawn carriage. It could actually operate with a total cost of ownership about a third of what it cost to deliver the same sort of efficiency as a horse-drawn carriage or horse-drawn carriages. But it didn't survive. It did not become the mode of transport in urban environments. And it didn't survive because the regulation that controlled the incumbent industry did not suit the innovation of a new industry. First lesson. You must have regulation that is created to take into account the opportunity for new technology and new innovation. If you base it on the existing technologies and the existing incumbent industries, you will disadvantage those new industries. And so the Turnpike Roads Act, I'll give you a couple of examples. 1773 and 1776 started to levy taxes because horses were damaging the dirt roads that were used, causing enormous ruts and everything else, and they needed repair. And governments and councils didn't have the money. So they developed levies and taxes and toll houses to actually levy those taxes. But they based those taxes on the number of horses, the number of hooves, the size of the carriage. So when steam engines came along, they didn't know how to levy the tax. So they based it on what's the equivalent of horses. Well, of course, if I was doing the work of 20 horses, well, I got 20 times the tax. So you got taxed out of business in terms of your efficiency. So the regulations disadvantaged the new technologies. And it was the same with the Highways Act. Horses going more than a certain speed were really dangerous, particularly in urban environments. Horses are pretty unpredictable animals. They bolt on you, they run away, they haven't got good brakes. And so there's a danger in having them go too fast. So the Highways Act controlled speed. But speed was the big thing that the steam engine was able to provide. And so it stopped it using its efficiency and its innovative benefit and prevented that industry ever being able to take it away. I could go through the Locomotives Act, which did virtually the same thing. It wasn't until you get to the end of the 19th century and you get things like the Locomotives on Highways Act that began to recognize the way in which we should not be restricting speed. And eventually the Motor Car Act of 1903 that enabled these industries to actually flourish and gain their efficiencies and advantage over the incumbent industries. So, of course, although the global manure crisis is an invention, in 1898, all of the major government leaders from around the world in those big cities did come together for a 10-day conference to look at this problem. It was a very, very real problem. Sewage systems were being blocked up, water was being polluted. We had a difficulty in managing the growth of this system, and everybody recognized it was going to present with enormous problems in the future if we didn't fix it. But of course, the incumbent industry said, don't worry, we can fix it. We can fix it. We'll just breed horses that don't defecate as much. You know, I mean, I don't need to tease out that analogy with what's going on there. We'll just make horses work harder. In fact, the double-decker bus was invented. The double-decker bus was invented to enable horses to carry more people than a simple private carriage. So let's get horses to do more for the amount of manure they produce. Or let's train horses so they don't defecate as much. We can kind of potty train them. But of course, the scientists came along and said, well, you don't understand the physiology of a horse. You can't quite do that. So, so again, all these possibilities of making the incumbent industry part of the solution did not work. Okay, so everybody says, and the technologists say, oh, well, it was the internal combustion engine solved the problem. The internal combustion came along and it was all fixed. Not so fast. Not so fast. The internal combustion engine was first used in 1826, some 60, 70 years before this crisis. Okay? And so the internal combustion engine didn't come along and suddenly solve the problem. No single technology solved the problem. In fact, it wasn't until 60 years later that you had the first commercial development of a motor vehicle powered by an internal combustion engine. It was this beautiful machine developed by Karl-Heinz Benz called the Patent Motorwagen in 1886. Look at it, it's absolutely spectacular. What a beautiful machine. But, look at it, it's basically got bicycle wheels with very thin steel spokes, very thin wheels. And anybody who knows anything about engineering and cycling, a kilo on your wheels is the equivalent to 10 kilos of belly on the cyclist. So you keep weight down on the wheels. So you had very lightweight wheels, very thin rims, in order for this very small engine to drive this machine. So it looks beautiful, but imagine it in roads like this. It was not going to work. Even though you have a motor vehicle there, it's actually being towed by a horse and cart. So that internal combustion engine put into the first motor vehicle was not going to solve this problem on roads like this. Okay? So we needed another set of technologies that happened to have been developed at the same time. I'll go through just a few of them just to give an example. The first was developed by John Loudon and McAdam. Macadamizing. McAdam worked out that the best way to deal with all of these potholes and ruts that were formed in road was to put a surface on the top of granite chippings. And he worked out that if the granite chippings were less than 2 centimeters or 3/4 of an inch, then actually the 4-inch wheels of a wagon would consolidate the granite chippings and actually pack them down into a smooth, consolidated surface. So he developed this technique, macadamizing. Of course, it was incredibly expensive and time-consuming. You had hundreds of laborers chipping away with a little hammer, and you had obviously the foreman coming around checking that you're not putting stuff in the bucket that was bigger than 2 centimeters or 3/4 of an inch. And so it was very time-consuming. You then had to transport it, lay it down on the road, get people, rake it out, and then get people to actually hammer it down into a smooth surface. Of course, the steam engine helped. The steam engine could actually break up the rock. You could have these sieves that would sieve it so only the right particles fell through. You could transport it. You had a steamroller that could do it. So macadamizing was a huge step, but very time-consuming, very expensive. In fact, when they macadamized the first road out of Washington, D.C., which was the Cumberland Road going westwards, it took 5 years just to lay 117 kilometers. So to macadamize the entirety of London or New York or everything else was going to take forever. Okay? But it was an important other technology that came along. We then had, as you'll all know, Charles Goodyear with the vulcanization of rubber. People had tried to cut down on the cost of making wheels with the steel rims around the wooden wheel by replacing that steel rim with rubber. Rubber had been around for centuries, but of course rubber's very, very soft, and as soon as you get heat through that rubber, it softens even more, and stuff was flinging off. The granite chippings on the road were cutting into the rubber, and it was completely destroying the wheel, and without the steel rim, you were then breaking these wooden wheels. So it wasn't going to work until Goodyear vulcanized rubber. I don't think people realize here the importance of vulcanization of rubber. Every car has been totally dependent on vulcanized rubber. The speeds with which we travel, the heat that we generate in our tires, they would explode if you didn't have vulcanized rubber. So it's been one of the most significant innovations in history in terms of our forms of transportation. But it wasn't until John Lloyd Dunlop came along and said, well, hang on, if we can have a rubber insert inside that outer shell, and we can pump it full of air, and we've got a pneumatic tire, and actually developed a pneumatic tire for bicycles, because bicycles couldn't ride down those roads that you just saw. They would break the wheels. They were too difficult. The bicycle was a toy that you rode around the local park on a Sunday. It wasn't a vehicle of transportation. But as soon as you got the pneumatic tire that could absorb shocks and stop your spokes breaking, bicycle became as a form of transport. It was then seen as an opportunity for the motor car industry to use those pneumatic tires, which could absorb shocks, which could spread the load, and so on. And so Dunlop developed the pneumatic tire in 1888. A third invention that became very, very significant was a discovery by chance by a guy called Edgar Purnell Hooley, who ran a coal tar factory in Nottingham in the UK. And one of his carts went out of the factory and turned over and spread all of this coal tar all over the road. And of course, you can't wash it away because it's not soluble in water. And so there's this sticky mess all over the road that's going to impact everything. But next door was a macadam factory that had all these granite chippings. So he got a load of macadam and he threw it over the top of the coal tar. And then when he came back later, it was set solid. You couldn't shovel it. You couldn't get rid of it. It was set absolutely solid. And he thought, oh my God, this is the answer. And he invented tarmac. And tarmac is still that preferred term. If you listen to your pilot when they come into land, even though they're landing on concrete runways, they'll go, I'll soon have you touching down on the tarmac, because it was so strong and so powerful and able to resist those forces of things traveling on it that it became this really important form of technology. And in fact, the first road, tarmac road, was in Nottingham, outside his factory, in 1903, the Radley Road, that used a tarmac as a surface. So, these other technologies were coming together at the same time. And that doesn't even mention petrol. If you want an internal combustion engine to run, you've got to have petrol. The original forms of tar and coal tar were too heavy. They were too difficult to work with, and you couldn't carry enough of them to get the power you needed until a Russian called Vladimir Shukov enveloped a cracking process that refined these oil products into what we now call petrol or gasoline. And then, of course, that meant you could develop something called a carburetor, which would draw vapor into an engine, which you can compress air, you can compress a vapor, you cannot compress a liquid. Anybody who's unfortunate enough, I won't ask you to put your hands up, who's tried to drive your lovely SUV through a river in the high country and sucked water into your engine and broken it immediately will know what I'm talking about. You cannot compress liquid, but you can compress air. So the carburetor needed to be invented. You need to invent a dynamo that turned a battery output into a powerful enough spark. You need to invent a distributor that would distribute that spark at exactly the right time that the cylinder was at the top of its chamber. You need multiple technologies and inventions that came together through a process we call convergence. Okay? And when you had that convergence, suddenly you've enabled the industry. But of course, you needed government regulation, you needed changes in regulation, you needed government policy intervention to then support that industry. It's no good just having a car that can run on petrol. If the petrol station was 25 kilometers away and my tank only delivered 50 kilometers, by the time I've got home from the petrol station, I've got to turn around and go back and fill it up again. So you needed to encourage and incentivize entrepreneurs to build little way stations along the way with petrol stations, with their own little family businesses where stop and fill up with petrol, we'll clean your windshield, we'll wipe down your car, come inside and have a cut lunch and a cup of tea while we're doing it all for you and start our own little business. You needed to get those entrepreneurs who saw that opportunity with that convergence of all those industries. And once you had it, the investors came along. Once the regulations like the Motor Act of 1903 gave an opportunity for the development of that industry, investors saw that and grasped it. An interesting story about Dunlop and his business was it was an investor who came along and said, I can see the future of this. And he bought the company off Dunlop in the late 1890s. And he sold cheap shares to the transport journalists who were predicting the future of transport. And he bought the company for £3 million UK pounds, and he sold it 2 years later for £5 million and made those investors £1.7 million in profit in 2 years. Because he saw the future and he saw the opportunity for investors buying small shares into that business to develop it. And of course, you then began to see the industry grow. You saw companies like Oldsmobile, and look at their marketing. The next thing you needed to have, not just the government regulation, not just the policy intervention, not just the technology, not just the investors, you needed consumers to want this. And those consumers were sold on the benefit of, you now have the freedom of transport even if you don't have land to afford a horse. So it was marketed to business professionals, to merchants, to bankers, to doctors, to lawyers. For £650 you could buy an Oldsmobile. Look how reliant it is. You don't need a horse. You can just turn the engine on and off you go. You have freedom. So consumers needed to be taken on that journey. And of course, as we well know, we then came along with Henry Ford. Much has been said about Henry Ford developed the motor car industry. Ford did not invent things like the production line, division of labor. He saw it in other industries, but he saw an opportunity for this emerging technology to build cars using pattern parts, where you could manufacture the same part in many, many volumes, and then on a production line, just put them together and make this vehicle. And if it got damaged, you just replace that part. So he enabled it to be cheaper. And in 1908, he rolled out the first Model T Ford. When he rolled out the last Model T Ford that looked like this, in 1927, he'd already sold 15 million cars. And that really was the thing that kicked off the use of the motor car and the death of the horse-drawn carriage. Of course, they didn't disappear. The incumbent industry didn't go away. And in fact, they coexisted for a very long time. My childhood memories are very strong around the excitement of every morning, and this is very early memory in the 1960s, of the milkman coming around on his horse-drawn cart with great big urns and running out with an enamel jug with a linen cloth over the top for the milkman to pull out of the urn and fill our jug with milk. Okay, by the time I was 5 or 6 or 7, that was gone. And you had motorized milk carts and you had bottles and everything else. But I also remember the rag and bone man, the scrap metal merchant coming around. I remember the coal man coming around. I remember the paraffin man, still on a horse and cart. In fact, pictures like this still existed for many, many years. In fact, my grandmother, born in 1907, when she was 7 years old, with her brother, who was 10 years old, he stopped holding her hand and he ran across the road in front of a horse and cart, knowing he could run across the road faster than the horse and cart. He did not see the car coming up the inside. He was knocked down, hospitalized with a broken leg and broken pelvis, and in hospital in the very poor sanitary conditions in the hospital, developed an infection and died. So the first victim, one of the first victims in 1910 of the motor car. These coexisted for a long time, and you can see here a tram, you can see a car on the side, you can see that motor industry. But of course now, it's gone. That incumbent industry is gone, but it's taken nearly 100 years. And then we look at the development of the internal combustion engine. This is the epitome of that technology. This is an engine made by Wärtsilä, a Finnish company. It is the biggest internal combustion engine in the world. Just for perspective, you can see the size of it against the truck. It is 13.5 meters tall, it's 27 meters long. It is a two-stroke diesel internal combustion engine, slow revolution. It can transport ships like the Emma Maersk, in which it's fitted, with over 15,000 20-foot containers on board, each weighing 14 tons, and deliver the output of 110,000 horses. Look at where our technology has taken us. Look at our innovation. But of course, that has also created the problem. Also created that problem for us and developed and enhanced that crisis that we're now facing. And I'm reminded, Mindy's talked about some of our indigenous culture and the wisdom we should get from that. I'm reminded of the great laws of the Iroquois Nation in North America, which is embedded into their constitution, that the decisions we make should take into account the future of the next 7 generations of our people. We failed miserably. Our scorecard is pretty bad. So I'm not going to talk anymore about the real crisis that we're into. We've already had that, and Andy's really painted that picture very clearly. It is a very, very significant crisis. It's an existential crisis. It could be the end of life as we know it on the planet if we don't fix that crisis and if we don't recognize the importance of food systems in addressing that crisis. I've managed to talk for as long as I've talked, using euphemistically the term horse manure. Of course, horse manure is actually horse dung combined with organic material and use of fertilizer. So I've avoided the obvious terms for what comes out of the back end of a horse, but if you'll permit me just one expletive. If we do not solve this crisis and do not start to solve it now, we really will be deep in the shit. Thank you.